People, no matter who we are, have dreams. They look at some with a positive aspect of it. They live their life seeking a dream that they've placed deep within them ever since the time they were a small child. They look at that dream, and it's the one thing that they never take their eyes off of. They look at life knowing that they will and must accomplish that dream. And every day they live, they dream of that and work toward that, and their life is geared to it. But yet we see there's others that may have that same dream, but yet in the process of life, it beats them down to where that dream literally almost dies. And sadly, in many of our lives, we face that same thing. Trials and persecutions come in, and the first thing that comes to mind is to quit. We give up. So many times in those situations, we look at the Bible and we give up on it. We give up on prayer. We give up on God. And then we just try to fight through it alone. And that dream just literally dries up and passes away. But if God's given us a dream, it's a gift. And we have to look at it in that way. He's given us a dream, and He's given us the desire to work that dream out in our lives. And the beauty of it is that He's given us everything that we need to accomplish it. We then do not have the right to quit. Paul tells us in Romans 11:29, "For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable." One of the greatest pictures we see of this is in the life of the man Joseph in the Old Testament. Joseph in Genesis 37 and verses 5 through 11, we see this same thing. He says, "Now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. So he said to them, 'Please hear this dream which I have dreamed.' They were binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright. And indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. And his brothers said to him, 'Shall you indeed reign over us? And shall you indeed have dominion over us?' So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, 'Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me.' So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, 'What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow down to the earth before you?'" How that must have struck Jacob, being such a prideful man. But yet, this is the dream that God put in Joseph's heart. And to me, it's exciting to watch this because it tells us much about our own dreams. This young man was given a dream that would be fulfilled not in that moment, but through his entire life. And this is, I think, many times where we run into trouble. We look at our dreams and we look at them and we think, man, we want this right now. God's given it to me. This is happening. He said it, and I believe it, and it's going to take place right at this moment. But in this case, it didn't. And in many times in our lives, it doesn't take effect that quickly. But yet this dream was a driving force to get him through some of the greatest hurdles that a man could ever face. Because we see Joseph's dream described as well being fulfilled by the garments that Joseph wore. If we can take the time to view these garments, it's interesting how they all played out, and they all become a great part of the dream that Joseph was able to obtain in his life. We see the first coat that he wore was one given by his father. Joseph's coat of many colors. And this is the coat that we all, from the time many of us were in Sunday school, understood and learned about. But what this did was something that was amazing, because what it did was establish favor by that destiny of greatness that Jacob was putting on Joseph. And not only Jacob, but the blessings that God was about to deliver into his life, and not really even his life only, but the complete nation of Israel. We know that through this, without Joseph being blessed by this, they would have probably disintegrated in the desert when that famine was so harsh. But we have no idea how long Joseph walked in the comfort of this coat. Yet one thing is very certain: when we have that dream embedded into us, it's all that we desire to speak and live about. And Joseph was proud of that dream, and he wanted to share it with his brothers and to all them that would listen, because this was something that to him was of great value. But it was also something that come with testing, and it was a time where this coat brought not only a testing of Joseph, but a testing of his faith and how that dream would work out. We then have to move on to Genesis 37 and verses 31 through 33. It says, "So they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. They then sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, 'We have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?' And he recognized it and said, 'It is my son's tunic.' A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn into pieces. Joseph lost his beautiful coat, and his dream could have died right there. But it was not in Joseph to let up, and it was not for him to give up. It wasn't God's will for him to give up. But let's notice now what takes place, because now we see something change. When he was stripped of the coat of many colors, now we put on the robe of slavery. Even in a state of slavery, his dream never died out. It's something that lived on. How do we know this? Now, as we read these verses, we need to pay attention to the wording. Now, note in Genesis 39 and 2 through 4, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put under his authority. It says here that Joseph prospered. This prospered means he pushed forward. I like that, because even though in this situation it wasn't his coat of favor, his coat of many colors that he was walking around proudly with, now he was a slave. But it says he prospered, he pushed forward. There was no quit in Joseph. Even in this situation that seemed so hopeless, his dreams kept him steadfast. It satisfied him every day, believing that God was going to work through this. Somehow, some way, God was going to move. However, what we do see is the thought that it may not seem like this coat produced contentment. We can look at this and say, you got to be kidding me. He was a slave. He could only do what this man would allow him to do. But Joseph knew he had escaped the horrors of that pit. He could have went to a whole lot worse place as a slave. He could have ended up in a field or a mine or any such thing. But Joseph trusted God to continue the fulfillment of his dream. So as he looked at this, being took out of the pit, put into slavery, he went to a man's house to where he could find favor. He found the luxury that he was used to. He found that peace, and he was over this whole household, and it brought him, I believe it brought him a contentment. Even though just as a servant, he found still favor because he felt at ease. His brothers now were not belittling him. He wasn't feeling the evil of them trying to break him every day because of the jealousy that he had. But yet it didn't stop there, because eventually that kind of reared its head once again, because we see now that Potiphar's wife desired Joseph. She wanted him in a carnal way, but yet loyalty would not allow Joseph to take part in this. In Genesis 39:12, we read of this story, and it says, "And she caught him by his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' And he left his garment in her hand and fled and got him out." To me, that's a powerful statement, because many young men would have stayed there. But yet Joseph fled that scene because of the fact he was loyal not only to his master, but most of all to his God. Because now once again the coat in his dream was ripped off of him, just like his coat in many colors. We see this as a terrible thing. But why would God allow it? I mean, that's what many times, if we were in this situation, this is where we end up. Why would God allow this to happen? But it's very obvious that God desired him to fulfill his dream or his call that was up on his life. And God had to get him to a place where he could get him exactly where he needed him to be. And he could not do that in the house of Potiphar. And this leads us to the third place, his prison robe. This prison robe was the coat of humility. I think with all these luxuries that Joseph had fallen into, he lived a life of ease with Jacob. He was the favored son. Now he was with Potiphar. He was the favored servant. He gained everything. But Joseph, I think, might have had just a little tint of pride, and I believe that God had to take that away from him. So we see this coat of humility that was put on him. And at this point, it had to make Joseph wonder if his dream was real, or if it was, was it truly from God, or was this something that just he made up in his own life? Did his mind just desire something so much that this is all he desired? I don't believe that's the case. I believe this was from God. But when we come to this place, we must understand that God desires us to come to this place of humility, to where we realize that if this dream is going to happen, we must trust in him. It's not something that we can do on our own. We have to humble ourselves before him and allow that dream to be lived out, and to allow the Holy Spirit to work in our life in such a way that it begins to produce. When we put this coat on, we realize that it no longer is what I can do or accomplish. It's not up to me. It is a matter of faith. Joseph's faith was tested in this prison. All too often here, we just go through the motions and turn faith into hope. And Joseph could have done that. It would have been very easy for him to come to this place. And if we're not careful at this point, hope will move into our lives in such a way we take our eyes off God's timing and we begin to seek to open that door on our own. Now, I believe this is what happened to Joseph. We don't hear this talked about much, but as I read this story and I really contemplate this, I think this is what happened with Joseph. Joseph went on his own, using the gifts God gave him to get his freedom. So many times God gives us gifts and we end up using them more in the world than we do for God. And I believe Joseph was trying to do that right here. He desired these men to take his case before the Pharaoh. He interpreted their dreams. He allowed them to be something that Joseph could use to get before the Pharaoh to realize his innocence. But note what we read in Genesis 40 and verses 14 through 15. But think on me when it shall be well with thee, and show kindness, I pray thee, unto me, and make mention of me unto Pharaoh, and bring me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also have I done nothing, that they should put me into this dungeon. Yet in verse 23, God closed this door. Yet did not the chief butler remember Joseph, but forgot him. For as now we see now, it wasn't that path that Joseph was on. It was now in God's timing. God wants us to know here and now that dreams that he puts into our life, they will be accomplished, but not through manipulation of the gifts that he's placed within us. We can't use those gifts to manipulate a situation. According to Genesis 41:1, it took 2 full years for Joseph to get that opportunity to get out of that prison. Now, to me, that's impressive. I really sometimes wonder what went through the mind of Joseph during those 2 years. I know that it was a great time of humility, but I think it was also a time of soul searching, realizing that he was in God's hand, God's control, and God's timing, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Now it was just a matter of Joseph being faithful and trusting God throughout that whole situation. But this leads us to the fourth robe, the robe of fulfillment. Now note this in Genesis 41 and verses 41 and 42. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, See, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring, put it from his hand, and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in the vesture of fine linen. In the Hebrew, that word means robe, and put a gold chain about his neck. Now, at this point, Joseph must have been flooded with awe of his God. 2 full years he waited on this moment, and now it's coming about. From that time that he was just a young man holding on to this dream, it was now coming to reality. He was seeing that reality of his dream, and how elated he must have had to been. But the entire time he lived in his life in Egypt, he was allowed to operate in the reality of his dream. But we have to ask the question here, was his dream complete? In a mighty way it was, but yet there was still some things to be fulfilled. But let's note again the dream that Joseph had in Genesis 37:10. So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, What is your dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I, your brothers, indeed bow down to you, to the earth before you? This was the thing that we have to look at. Is this something that has taken place? So let's note Genesis 42:6. Now Joseph was governor over the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him, and with their face to the earth. It was now complete. Now these boys that sold him into slavery, that lived their life probably with a regret, now stood before Joseph, not knowing who he was, but yet at the same time they bowed to him. But what is interesting to me in this is the fact that we never read of Jacob bowing to Joseph. You'll never see that. and it causes people to question this, but I don't. I think that this is something that's powerful. I believe it's a thing of respect, but yet at the same time, I believe that in a way Jacob did bow to Joseph because he understood that the fulfillment of Joseph's dream now was coming about. Because if Joseph was not the leader of that nation, and if Joseph would not have prepared for that time of famine, then Jacob would have never been able to come there with his family and gain the ability that he needed to succeed for his, not only his family, but for that nation. So what we realize is, if you dig deep into this, this is something that in reality I think Jacob did bow down. Maybe not literally, but in his heart he did, and in his mind he did, because he knew without Joseph he had no way of success. But if you dig into these, the only true coat that Joseph ever wore was the one that his father placed upon him. It was that coat of many colors. The rest of them were just robes that were an imitation of the real thing. So when the dream was given, these other three robes, what do they mean? Not a lot, but our true authority as well as our identity comes from the Father, and that's what we must see. The coat is the garment that protects us. It is His covering that is over us. Even though it may be stripped off on the exterior, it's something that still truly identifies us to who we are. It is a coat of promise that's sealed in the blood of Christ. Robes are what we just have placed upon us. They wear out. They can be stripped from us. They are very needed. Yet at the same time, they're simply coming to a means of an end. That's all they are. They're a means to an end to get us to the fulfillment of the dream that God has for our life. You have been given a dream. If you've been given a dream, and I believe we all have been called according to a purpose, which in my mind tells me that God's given me a dream that I can look to Him to fulfill. Trust God and begin to live your dream. Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't give up. Stay strong to your dream.